So this is the second lecture on chapter 1 of the sociological perspective. In the first video lecture, I introduced the triangle, which is considered which is the social structure. And in the context of the triangle, what we talked about sociological imagination. And the imagination is just like any imagination. It's looking beyond or imagining something different. And in this context, we're going to try to imagine the patterns or imagine explanations for the patterns that we see in society. And one of the concepts concepts to imagine is this phenomena of social location, and that's what this triangle is about. Like I say, you'll see it a lot. Social location, in which we are all these dots, right? Society is broken up there are fewer powerful people and a whole lot of less powerful people, and then we're one of these little dots, and we're surrounded by people who share our social location, right? So that's another concept. Another really important concept to imagine is this idea, I'm trying to get my slides to share them with you again. To imagine is what's the relationship between the individual and the group. Now, I realize in the previous lecture, I suggested that there's no such thing as the individual, but that's not exactly how we experience the world. We experience the world as an individual. So the sociological imagination asks us to consider or to imagine how the individual, or how you and myself, are influenced by the larger society or by the larger groups. Again, with the assumption, or with the premise, that we are products of all of these social influences, right, within the social concept, within the social context. Society, of course, we're going to use that to refer to all of the different groups that we share in our culture. Chapter 2 will actually go into depth about all of the specifics. What is the definition of culture? What are the elements of culture? But now we'll talk about social location. Now, there are three big areas, three big topics when I talk about social location, and those are race, class, and gender. And they're so significant that we'll actually have a whole chapter where that's all we talk about. Well, it was race will be one chapter, class will be another chapter, gender will be another chapter. A good sociologist never fails to ask the question, how does one's race or one's class or one's gender influence or affect the way a phenomena is perceived, the way a phenomena affects them? Never fails to notice, right, that we are sorted out by race, class, and gender. So, for instance, I zoom in with one sociology class, right? And as a sociologist, and having thought with this perspective for most of my life, certainly all of my adult life, I can't help but notice that rooms are full of all men or full of all women, or that there are no people of color, right? So, or that the group is sorted out by all the boys in one section and all the girls in another section. I can't help but notice those patterns. That's just the way I see things these days, right? My sociological imagination. Other parts of the sociological imagination and perspective would be like to think globally and locally. So we experience our daily life, of course, on the local level, but the sociological perspective, this bigger perspective, says, but what are the implications, or what effect does my local personal behavior have on the global? Or how does the global processes, how does what's happening between the nations affect my local experience, right? I I realize this is not a topic that everyone is on board with, but certainly as the climate patterns are changing, right, this has global implication, but you and I are experiencing that on an individual, on a personal, local level. Right, we're noticing when if there's snow or if there's no snow, or when countries around the world are in conflict, it affects our personal price, our personal local price for gas, right? And that's what the sociological perspective is. Sometimes I liken it to this, is the difference between, so I used it in two, I can think of two metaphors that are useful for me. One is that when we first moved, is the difference between living in the country and living in town, right? When we first moved to Manhattan, we lived out in the countryside and we had no neighbors. And I could sit, we lived out basically in the middle of a farmer's field. We rented an old farmhouse. And I could sit in my hammock and I could see, you know, for I don't know how far away, but I could see on the horizon, you could see the weather patterns, or you could predict how weather patterns were going to change. You could see storms moving in across the horizon, right? You could see how over there it was cloudy, or over there there was the sun was shining, and here it was cloudy. So that's the big perspective. And then when I moved to town and we bought a house downtown in an older neighborhood where the trees had all canopies, right? There where it was all shade everywhere. I could see off the back porch to this day, I can see this little square of sky. So I have a much narrower perspective. Now, both cases, I can see sky. I can see the same thing, right, as I could out in the country. But when I just look straight up, looks very different, and I have a whole lot less information about the weather than when I lived out in the country and I could see broad, right? I think about actually one of the things that I looked forward to when I took this job and began commuting again was that I would get to see sky again. I would get to see, you know, vastness. And so the sociological perspective is really about vastness. It's really about looking at the big picture instead of where what do they say, they can't see the forest for the trees, right? It's about looking at the forest and noticing how that one spindly little tree is affected by its relationship, its placement in the larger forest. It's not that one little tree's fault that it can't grow. It's not trying to grow. It just happens to have been fermented or fertilized there in a part of the forest where there wasn't enough light, or everyone else was taking up all of the resources. And that's what the sociological perspective is about. It's about recognizing you as the tree, or your brother as the tree, or that homeless guy on the corner, but it's about recognizing the personal, or I think it says in your handout, what does it say? Connect your biography with history. No, okay, but the personal and the recognize how your personal biography, yeah, there it is, your personal biography is affected by these larger forces. And for some people, this is a really powerful way of thinking, right? Because it helps them go, oh, wait, this isn't all my doing. This isn't all my making, but there's forces upon me, there's forces upon this tree that make it hard for it to grow, right? But for other people, they don't really like that, because they may be the tallest tree in the forest and believe that they're the tallest tree because because they have always been the strongest and they've worked hardest to get to that sun. That's the reason they're the tallest and the strongest and the wealthiest and the most successful. Not because they just happen to have been lucky and to have been born in the right place in the social structure. Another concept, and maybe I'll keep going. Another concept is what we mean by intended and unintended consequences. And I suspect your mother probably talked about this, you know, when you were in middle school about, well, we think we do things, but this, this speaks to our what am I trying to say? This speaks to our understanding of, or the sort of notion that, like, for instance, social policy, right? That we may seek to fix a social issue, or we may do something good, say for my group, but what are the unintended? What is the cost to somebody else? Um, I'm trying to think. One that you often hear about is that if we should, and this is probably not the best example, but if we were to raise people's wages, right? The one side, if we were to raise people's wages, say to $15 an hour, make the minimum wage $15 an hour. Well, businesses often respond to that with, well, that would drive up the cost of housing and that would make everything more expensive. Well, that's one way to think about an unintended consequence. But the research, and that would sort of seem across the board, that kind of would make sense. But I'll tell you what the patterns in the data say. The patterns in the data, if you look again at places, at the patterns where wages are higher, you do see that rent is also higher. But rent did not go up after wages went up. In fact, what we see is in places where wages are higher, often the economy is better, because when you give low-income people more money, they spend it almost immediately. There is a reason, for instance, when we hear politicians talking about a stimulus package, right? When we give poor people money, they spend it almost immediately, right? And they spend it, and they're way more likely to spend it in their local economy. It doesn't, in fact, cause rent to go up, right, when we raise wages. That's not exactly an example of intended versus unintended consequences. The one that I traditionally use is, you're late for work, and so you speed, right? Because that makes sense, that if you're gonna have to drive faster to get to work. Well, instead you get pulled over. Well, that's not exactly what you meant to happen. Right? But it's also true that sometimes what we think the consequences will be are not really what's going to happen, right? So we don't necessarily, so we have to look for the patterns. And the thing about when we start researching humans, just like I said back in psychology, was when we start looking at humans, we can't really put people in a petri dish and say deny a group of people in education and employment to see what happens, to see if more of them turn into serial killers and criminals. That we just don't do that. We kind of universally agree that that's unethical. So the best that we can do as social science researchers is make observations about a group of folks who don't have these resources and compare those observations to people that do. Right? We have to look for patterns. We have to compare this group with this group, and then try to explain why these patterns exist. What are all of the various, what possibly could be the explanation? And that's when we're going to get to theory, and that's also in this chapter, is theory. So I'm going to stop right now, where we've talked about global, local, intended and unintended consequences.